Jeff and Jay here with another edition of Jay's Big Adventure. Jay's the Fuzzy Guy, and today we're doing a little paint touch-up on our 1978 BMW R80/7. So we decided that we would paint the frame rails, but as I did a little bit more inspection, there's quite a bit of area that needs to be done. So I really think the easiest thing to do is going to be just to take the whole rear frame off and paint that separately. To do that, we're going to take these bolts off here. I've already got these bolts out. We'll take the fender bolts loose, and then with this set aside, once I get the shock bolts off, that whole rear frame should come out in one piece. To remove the taillight, we're going to have to get the bolts, which are up in here. We got this nice long extension with a couple of wobblies to fit up under the fender. Then we can spin the handle down here. Because the wires run through this tube, I'm just going to tape this in place for now so we're not putting any stress on those connections. We're going to need to remove the wiring because we're going to take all this apart. To get these clips out, just get in here with a screwdriver and pull. With these bolts off and the wiring disconnected, I'm going to take the two bottom bolts on each side and the shock mounts, and the whole frame and fender should lift off as one piece. With the shock bolts removed, the entire assembly just lifts right off. Now we can prep, sand, and paint the frame and the battery box. To get the battery box out, we'll remove these three bolts on the bottom and these two on the sides. And we've got some wiring that's attached here, so we're going to cut that off as well, and then we'll fold that out of the way. The next step is to use degreaser and a lot of elbow grease. To properly finish up the paintwork, we're going to need to take these bolts off as well. These are for the passenger foot pegs, and those are 17 millimeters. With the four mounting bolts removed, we can separate the fender from the rear subframe. What I found interesting is that this is not metal. I thought that would be the case, but it is fiberglass or plastic, and it's really light. Now it's time to do a whole bunch of sanding. So now comes the fun part, which is just scuffing the entire surface. And this is 360, I think. And anywhere where there was rust before or a scratch, we're just going to make sure that that gets blended so that when I put the new paint on, you won't be able to tell that was there. Same kind of thing here. You just want to keep sanding until that blends in. Now here's some more we're going to need to work on, but we're just going to keep working on this until we're satisfied, get it all good and scuffed up, and then we'll lay down the first coat of primer. Remember, anything that you don't want to have painted, like this keyhole, needs to be masked off. So we're just going to put a piece of tape over that and then use our X-Acto knife to cover around the outside edge. With the tape on, we're just going to cut around the outside edge of our lock cylinder. Once you've cleaned everything one final time, just slowly paint over the surface. Okay, so here we are on day 2, and it turned out pretty well. That battery box had quite a bit of rust in it. I got all that sanded out, and this is coated nicely. I've got the threads protected, had some tape on there when I painted it, so that didn't get done, but that's actually pretty nice. The rear subframe, excuse me, Jay, also turned out pretty nice. So this was just kind of rusty here and there, and it had major scrapes and digs and dings, and you can see just some fine sanding marks in here, but overall that turned out really nice. And remember, this is just the primer. This is not the paint. This is just a primer coat. I did it in black primer just so that the gray wouldn't show through if at some point down the road I nicked it again, but that's pretty good shape. What we're doing today now is finishing up the rest of the frame, and that's what started this whole project. Is originally I just wanted to fix this stuff, and today we're going to sand all this, get it prepped, and then we're going to mask everything off that we don't want to paint so we can do the primer coat on the frame. Tomorrow, when the actual paint shows up, we'll be ready to go with the final coat. For starters, we're just going to use this bristle brush on a cordless drill. Just knock some of the rust off and some of the edges off, and then we'll get to some finer sandpaper, and I've got some 360. We'll start there and see whether we need to do any more, but for now this will give us a good base. So we are done with the painting, and turned out really well. I mean, compared to the way this was before, this is a huge improvement, and it didn't take that much time or money. We're going to pull all the tape off, and this is one of the difficulties with a project like this, is you kind of don't know where to stop. To give the project just a little bit more bling, went to the hardware store and bought as much new hardware as I could find. A couple of these bolts are a little longer. I'm probably going to have to cut these off with the Dremel tool, but this is all stainless steel. It won't rust. It won't corrode. Looks a whole lot better than that. Okay, so the next step is to start the reassembly process. I think we're going to install the battery box first, because that'll be easier to work on without the seat frame here. And then we're going to clean up the fender a little bit, bolt it back onto the seat carrier. We should be good to go. Before we reinstall the rear fender, we're just going to clean it up really well, give it a little bit of a polish, and then do a little bit of touch-up work. So we do stick. It's already looking a little better. Now I'll get out the touch-up paint. I'm going to spray a little bit of paint into an old water bottle cap. Then I can very gently apply the paint as needed. Applying a little more paint than needed just to fill in the scratch, so that when I buff it, it'll end up all being the same height above the surface. Now when we come back with the buffer, it'll all blend in really nicely. Certainly better than it was. While we're waiting for the paint to dry on the fender, we're going to reinstall the battery box. That's going to go in right here. And now we have new stainless steel hardware. And this style nut has a locking washer built right into it. While we're waiting for the paint on the other side to dry, we're just going to buff this a little bit, just see whether we can get some of this collidiness out of here. We're just going to use a mild abrasive compound and a rag, and this part we're going to do by hand. I don't know if we're going to be able to see the difference, but in the sun this has quite a bit of bronze tint to it. And as you come along right in here, you can see how cloudy the paint was just from 40 years of being out in the weather, but just a little bit of hand polishing really has brought that finish back, and it really shines in the sun. Now I'm just going to finish the fender, and then we can bolt it on. Next, we're going to bolt the fender back onto the seat frame. To do that, we're going to use our brand new stainless steel hardware, and we're going to reuse the backing plates that go underneath to give it a little bit more support. Now it's time to rehang the seat frame back on the bike. So I knew that the bolts that I bought were longer than the ones that I needed. Didn't quite realize they were that much longer, so we're just going to take off about 23 millimeters, 23 millimeters, and that way when you look down here you won't see the bolt hanging out, and there will still be enough for the threads. Now it's time to find the Dremel tool. With the top bolts lightly installed, now it's time to do the bottom ones. With those 4 bolts lightly installed, now we can tighten them up. Next, we reinstall the turn signals and brake light. To do that, we had to take the 2 screws out of the edge to pull this off. That gives us access to the nuts so we can tighten them from underneath the fender. With the bolts tightened up, it's time to reinstall the lens. With the taillight wire running through our clips, we just push those back into place. With the seat back on the pins, it's important that we add that last E-clip so that the seat can't slide off again. Just like that. Next, we'll reconnect the battery cables, reinstall the mount, and we should be good to go.